So it's my very great pleasure and honor to introduce our next keynote speaker, Klaus Oberauer, my colleague from the University of Zürich, from the psychology department. Klaus Oberauer is, of course, very well known. When we think about the word working memory, then, of course, the first name that comes into our mind is Bentley. But when we think about the persons who further developed the concept, then Klaus Oberauer is among those who really made very, very important contributions to this important concept. I sometimes say what the cell is for biology and what the molecule is for chemistry is working memory for psychology, because we can, in every area, we can explain things with this very important concept. Klaus has worked at very different stay in Berlin, at the Humboldt University, Freie University, and he was in Exeter. It was Bristol for many years. And then he became professor for experimental psychology at the University of Zürich. He developed tests on working memory, which were very much theory-based, and we are looking forward to his recent research.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elspeth, for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation. And I would like to take this opportunity to share with you the signal-to-noise ratio hypothesis of general intelligence that I have been developing together with my colleagues, Gielan Frischkorn, Annalena Schubert, Michael Nunes, and Christian Viebach. So our aim is to propose a causal explanation of general intelligence. And of course, what that means is to offer a causal explanation for the empirical basis of the famous or infamous G factor, which is the positive manifold, the observation that performance in all sorts of cognitive tasks tends to correlate positively with each other. Now, our field has generated several approaches to explaining the positive manifold. I identified three such general approaches. One is the good old common cause idea, the idea that there is a common cause contributing to our mind's ability to cope with all sorts of cognitive challenges. Then there is the idea that the positive manifold emerges from partial overlap in the processes engaged by all sorts of cognitive activities. Christoph has introduced the pod theory as one instance of this approach. And then there's the idea that every individual starts life with a bunch of independent specific abilities, which then mutually reinforce and support their development so that they, through their co-development, they end up being positively correlated. Now, our signal-to-noise ratio hypothesis stands in the old tradition of trying to find a common cause of cognitive abilities. And I want to start my argument with some general considerations about what could be a common cause of cognitive abilities across the board of all our cognitive activities. Because historically, my colleagues in cognitive psychology, whenever they looked for an explanation of intelligence, they looked at cognitive processes, because cognitive psychologists are good at identifying and measuring cognitive processes. Now, my colleagues and I think that this is a futile undertaking, because cognitive processes are highly specific. And we know that from training and transfer studies. Whenever a person trains in a skill, that training effect tends to transfer to very similar skills, very similar activities, but transfer is hardly ever very far. So for instance, when a person trains inductive reasoning, that doesn't transfer to deductive reasoning, although inductive and deductive reasoning tests are highly correlated. And so we think a more fruitful approach for looking for a common cause might be to look at general features, general characteristics of the cognitive system that affect the functioning of our information processing system across the board. And we think the signal-to-noise ratio of our cognitive system is a hot candidate for such a characteristic, because every information processing system is limited in its fidelity of information processing by the signal-to-noise ratio. So our hypothesis is that the cognitive system of human beings is characterized by a global signal-to-noise ratio, which varies between individuals in a somewhat stable way. And if these assumptions hold, then something like the positive manifold, the G factor, would naturally follow from that. So let me introduce the idea of the signal-to-noise ratio with a very simple example. Consider a stimulus in an environment of an organism that is relevant to that organism, such as, say, a traffic light that is first red, then green, then red again. Right? And a neural state in the brain of the cognitive of that organism that represents that stimulus should track its variation over time very closely. Now that representational state is overlaid by noise, which is variation that is not correlated to the stimulus of interest. Now, compared to this first hypothetical individual, a second hypothetical individual could have a poorer signal-to-noise ratio in two ways. Either by having a reduced signal strength, that means that the average neural state representing red versus green lights are closer together, are less distinct, or by having a larger amount of noise overlaid on that signal. Either way, the second individual, the one depicted on the right, would be less successful in reliably distinguishing red from green lights compared to the first. That's the basic idea, and this idea is not very novel. It has been captured long ago in psychophysics through signal detection theory, developed in the 1950s for tasks such as light discrimination, or, to take another example, pitch discrimination. If we ask an individual, for instance, to discriminate high and low tones, the assumption in signal detection theory is that the objective physical stimulus translates into a representational state in the cognitive system that is often called the subjective stimulus, subjective pitch, which varies on a dimension depicted here as the x-axis. And that is the basis for the decision, such that the decision-making process sets a criterion somewhere on this subjective pitch axis, such that when the subjective pitch, the representation of the tone's pitch is higher than the criterion, the decision is it's a high tone, otherwise it's a low tone. Now the problem is that the very same tone, when presented repeatedly, is not always represented in exactly the same way, because the representation is noisy. When you present the same high-pitched tone 100 times, then you can expect, according to signal detection theory, to get a distribution of representational states on that subjective pitch axis. And for the low-pitched tone, you get another distribution, shifted a bit to the lower end. Right? And so in this model, you could say the signal strength across many repetitions is the distance between these two distributions. The further they are apart, the easier it is for the decision maker to make accurate decisions. And the noise overlaid on that signal is represented by the standard deviation of these distributions. Right? So compared to the scenario on the left, the scenario in the middle has a better signal-to-noise ratio by virtue of these distributions being further separated, so the difference between their means is larger. And on the right, that's again another scenario of having a higher signal-to-noise ratio, in this case by virtue of having less noise, so smaller standard deviations of these distributions. Both these scenarios lead to better discrimination between high and lower pitch compared to the one on the left. Right? Now, the key parameter that we can get from signal detection model when we apply it to behavioral data from this kind of task is called this D' parameter, often described as discriminability. What this really is the ratio between the difference of the two means of the distributions to the standard deviation of the noise. So effectively, D' is the signal-to-noise ratio in decision-making. Okay. So far, so good. Now, when we approach the problem of general intelligence, general cognitive abilities, from the perspective of cognitive psychology, a good starting point, we think, my colleagues and I think, is to start from the best theories of how cognition works that our discipline has to offer. And we believe that our best theories in cognitive psychology are computational models of how cognition works. And cognitive psychology, cognitive science, over the decades has generated a lot of computational models, very well developed, very well tested computational models of cognition. But all these models are tailored to specific domains of cognition. So there are models of decision making, there are models of reward-based learning, there are models of recognition memory, there are models of free recall, and so on. And when you look across these models, they seem to, at first glance, they seem to share very little. But at a closer look, it turns out that many of these models do share one thing, and that is that they have a parameter that represents the signal-to-noise ratio of information processing. Not all cognitive computational models have that, but many do. Right? And that is one reason why we think, okay, this might be something that different cognitive activities, as described by these computational models, have in common. And that might therefore be a common cause of cognitive abilities across the board. And in particular, models in various domains that individual differences research has shown to be highly correlated with general intelligence. These models have a signal-to-noise ratio that controls and governs their performance predicted by the models. And then for the remainder of my talk, I want to walk you through three such domains: processing speed, sensory discrimination, and working memory, which are selected because performance in these domains has been shown to be highly correlated with general intelligence. So starting with processing speed, in the days of computer-based testing, processing speed is typically measured by giving people fairly simple decisions to be made very quickly and accurately as possible, such as deciding whether a word refers to an animal or a tool, or deciding whether a square is presented above or below a horizontal midline of the screen, or deciding whether a picture depicts a house or a face. And typically, we just take mean response time as the dependent variable. But then in cognitive psychology, there's a whole family of models, meanwhile, for these sorts of rapid decision tasks, often called evidence accumulation models or sequential sampling models. Radcliffe's diffusion model is probably the best known of these. And the diffusion model has meanwhile also been applied in individual differences research to get a bit closer to the underlying mechanisms of these simple decisions. The basic idea in the diffusion model and other models of that family is that as a stimulus is presented on which a person has to make a decision, over time, gradually evidence is extracted from that stimulus, and that evidence accumulates towards one of two response thresholds, an upper and a lower threshold, and whichever threshold is reached by this accumulated evidence determines the decision. Now, in this model, there are three core parameters. One is the rate at which evidence accumulates on average. That's the drift rate, the steepness of that evidence accumulation towards one boundary. The other parameter is a caution parameter, so how much evidence a person wants to accumulate before they are ready to commit to a decision. That's captured by the separation of these boundaries. The further they are apart, the more cautious a person is. And then there's typically a parameter for non-decision time, so time needed for early sensory processing and then motor processing, which is unrelated to the decision process. Now, a key insight in these models is that when we look at an individual trial, the evidence is very noisy, right? So on an individual trial, the accumulated evidence isn't just a straight dash towards one or the other boundary. It's rather fairly noisy up and down over time. So with the exact same stimulus, on one trial, you might have this ziggy-zaggy trajectory of evidence accumulation. On the next trial, it might look like that. And on a third trial, it might actually end up down there and give you a wrong response simply due to the noise. Right? And so the upshot of that is that one of the key parameters of the model, the drift rate, is not just the speed or efficiency of information processing, is the speed and efficiency of evidence accumulation relative to the degree of noise in the evidence. So again, this parameter reflects the signal-to-noise ratio in the system. Now, meanwhile, there are several individual differences studies that use the diffusion model to fit data from speed response tasks. And turned out that the drift rate is the one parameter of the model that consistently and fairly highly correlates with working memory capacity and also fluid intelligence. The other parameters tend to not correlate that highly with intelligence. So this is the first piece of evidence that it's the signal-to-noise ratio in simple decisions that is responsible for the correlation between speed in such decisions and intelligence. Turning to a second domain, sensory discrimination, there is meanwhile substantial research showing that fairly basic sensory discrimination ability is highly correlated to intelligence. This has initially been investigated by Thomas Ramsayer, Stefan Troche, and others in the domain of temporal discrimination. So participants would hear two short tones, for instance, one after the other, one say 800 milliseconds long, the other 750 milliseconds long, and they would have to decide which one is longer. So these are very subtle differences that people have to discriminate. Later research has also looked into visual discrimination, such as discriminating the subtle differences between tilts of gratings or discriminating lighter from a slightly darker gray, that sort of thing. Right? Now, it should be obvious after my introduction that these kinds of tasks can be analyzed in a straightforward manner by signal detection theory. So when you think of subjective duration, time discrimination task, we can again think of a subjective duration dimension that captures the mental representation of the perceived duration of one or the other tone. And then we have a distribution of representations for the longer tone and for the shorter tone, and some criterion, that's the blue vertical bar, that determines the decision. And we have a d prime parameter that is the ratio between the difference of the two means of the distributions relative to their standard deviation, which captures the signal-to-noise ratio. Right? So the signal-to-noise ratio, according to signal detection theory, would be the key determinant of success in these tasks. Now, individual differences studies on sensory discrimination so far have never used the signal detection model to analyze the data. I don't know why, but that's just how it is. Researchers have typically used other dependent variables measuring the accuracy of sensory discrimination. But it must be the case that these other dependent variables are closely related to d prime in signal detection theory. And in any case, accuracy performance in sensory discrimination has been shown to be highly correlated with intelligence across several studies. I just picked out two of them here. All right, turning to a third domain, working memory. There are now, I think, 3 decades worth of research showing that performance in working memory tasks is highly correlated with general intelligence. But there hasn't been that much development of relatively simple computational models in the domain of working memory that we could use as measurement models in individual differences research in the way that we, for instance, can use signal detection theory or the diffusion model in other domains. So my colleagues and I recently started developing such models, and I want to show you 2 such model developments for different paradigms in working memory. First paradigm I want to talk about is the complex span task, which has been introduced earlier today. So reading span, symmetry span are instances of this paradigm. The general idea in this kind of task is always that participants have to remember for a brief time a list of items in the correct order, and in between they have to do some distractor processing. So in our version of the complex span task, we present participants with a sequence of words alternatingly printed in red and black, and their job is to remember the red words in their correct order, just the red words. But in addition, they have to make a judgment on every word, the black and the red words. They have to judge whether the word refers to an object that's larger or smaller than a soccer ball. So now they have to remember the red words and in between also process the black words because they have to make a judgment on them. So the black words are sort of the distractors in this complex span paradigm. And then after presenting 5 red and 5 black words, we ask them to reproduce the list of red words by clicking on those words in order in this random arrangement of 15 words. So a correct response would start by clicking on ring, then on fan, then move on to fly, and so on. Right? Okay, so in this kind of task, at every point in the output sequence, the person could either give the one correct response, click on the one correct word, or make 3 kinds of errors. They could pick one of the 4 other list words, so there would be an order error. They would click on a word that was in the list but not in the correct list position. But they can also pick one of the 5 distractors, and they can also pick one of the 5 words that were not involved in the current trial at all, the 5 new words. Right? And our simple measurement model that we developed for this task is built on the assumption that at the point of retrieval, every response candidate receives a certain degree of activation that reflects the strength of evidence from memory for choosing that response option. So if we list the 15 response options here and consider a situation where the person tries to recall the second word, then if things don't go terribly wrong, the correct word would be activated the strongest. Other list words, the other 4 list words, would also be fairly strongly activated because they are very strong in memory. They are just not the correct ones right now. The distractors also receive a decent amount of activation because by virtue of having been processed, they are also somewhat strengthened in memory, though hopefully not as strong as the words of the memory list. And the new words, they would receive very little activation. Now, if this was all that's happening, then there would be an easy way to do this task. Just pick the one response option with the highest activation, you'd always get it right. But then, of course, not surprisingly for you by now, I assume all these activations on every trial would be overlaid by noise, which is simply drawn from a distribution centered on 0. So sometimes the noise is positive and pushes the activation up. Sometimes it's negative, pushes the activation down. And so with enough noise, it would happen quite often that one of the not correct response options would win the competition. That's how errors come about. Right? Now, it turns out that with one additional assumption about this noise distribution, this kind of model is equivalent to a version of signal detection theory for multiple alternatives. And by that equivalence, we get a very neat and compact formula that gives us the probability of choosing each of the 15 response options. And that probability depends on the ratio between the signal strength of each response option, the degree of activation on average, divided by the standard deviation of the noise. So once again, at the core of this formula is the signal-to-noise ratio. The probability of picking the correct response is a direct function of the signal-to-noise ratio, where the signal is the signal for that response. Now, we can apply a very similar model to another very popular paradigm of investigating and testing working memory, popular in particular for testing visual working memory, the continuous reproduction task. In this kind of task, participants' job is to remember for a second or so simple visual features of a number of stimuli, in this case just 2 colors. Once you go beyond 3, this task becomes surprisingly hard. And then after 1 second, one of the stimuli is highlighted typically by its location, designated as the target, and the person's job is to reproduce the exact color of that stimulus as closely as possible by selecting it from a continuous response scale, this color circle, this color wheel. Right? The nice thing about this task is that it gives you a continuous degree of error, the circular angular deviation from the correct color. Now, I recently developed a computational measurement model for this kind of task that basically incorporates the same assumptions as for the case of discrete response options, except that in this case we have a continuous scale of response options, which are centered on the correct color. So 0 would be 0 deviation from the correct color. And the idea is that at test, when we try to retrieve a color, we again get a sort of a signal strength for every possible color on the color circle. The strongest signal typically being the correct color, and then other colors similar to it also receiving some degree of signal strength or activation or evidence. And the steepness with which that generalization from the correct color drops off is captured by a parameter kappa, which is the precision parameter of this distribution, the dispersion parameter of that distribution, and the amplitude of that distribution is the signal strength, the parameter C in the model. Right? And now, again, the assumption is that every possible response is overlaid by some degree of noise, and then after adding noise, the system picks the response with the highest activation, which often is a color close to the correct color, but occasionally it can also be one very far off. And that captures very nicely the empirical error distribution. And again, it leads us to this equation for predicting the probability of each response. So once again, at the core of this equation lies the signal-to-noise ratio in the system, which determines the probability of picking a correct or low error response in this task. Now, I mentioned before that there is by now probably hundreds of studies showing that when we take raw scores from working memory capacity tests, they are typically highly correlated with intelligence. So this is a meta-analysis in latent factor space that we did nearly 20 years ago, but I think the picture hasn't changed much since then. But then so far nobody has tried to use computational measurement models to decompose performance in working memory tasks a bit more to get to the mechanisms in working memory that are actually driving that correlation. And so what I did is to try to apply one of these two measurement models that I just introduced to you, the signal discrimination model, SDM, for continuous reproduction tasks, and applied that to data from a large individual differences study by Nash Unsworth and colleagues. They had a huge battery of tasks, among them 5 versions of this continuous reproduction task with 5 different visual stimuli. And I fit that SDM model using Bayesian hierarchical techniques to each task. And that allowed me to extract the posterior probability distribution of the correlations between the parameters of the model across the 5 tasks. Now, here's an overview of the mean of these posterior distributions, or best estimate from the Bayesian estimation method for the intercorrelation between those 5 C parameters, so the parameter capturing the signal-to-noise ratio across those 5 versions of the task, and they're all strongly positively correlated. The kappa parameter, this generalization parameter, seems to be much more stimulus-specific. So these correlations are not so systematically positive, more or less all over the place. But the signal-to-noise ratio in this continuous reproduction task seems to have a lot of common variance, at least within the visual domain. And then, because Unsworth also had separate measures of working memory capacity and fluid intelligence, I took the liberty to just aggregate the 5 estimates of C across the 5 tasks and correlate that with fluid intelligence. Turns out the correlation is nearly 0.60. To working memory capacity, it's a bit lower. So this is another piece of evidence that if we extract the signal-to-noise ratio parameter from a measurement model applied to visual working memory and take the shared variance across 5 versions, that's a very good predictor of fluid intelligence. And I want to close with just one brief remark on what my colleagues and I consider a critical test of the signal-to-noise ratio hypothesis of intelligence. Our conjecture is that when we use computational measurement models, such as the ones that I introduced today, apply them to various domains of cognitive abilities, we extract the signal-to-noise ratio parameter from these models. We predict that these parameters would be positively correlated not only within variants of the same task, as I've just demonstrated, but also across different tasks. So the signal-to-noise ratio parameter, say, of the diffusion model, the drift rate, should be positively correlated with the signal-to-noise ratio parameter that we get from this SDM model, say, applied to continuous reproduction tasks. And the shared variance of signal-to-noise ratio across many, many different task paradigms, we predict should be highly correlated with intelligence. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for this very interesting and inspiring talk. I'm sure there are questions, and Kirsten is the first.
Thank you for this inspiring hypothesis. I would be interested to hear your thoughts how this would be neurally implemented.
Excellent question. I don't really know, to be honest. So my colleagues on this team are much more knowledgeable about the neuroscience of intelligence than I am. But from what I understand, there's surprisingly little discussion of the signal-to-noise ratio of neural computation in contemporary neuroscience. There is a lot of discussion about the positive and negative effects of neural variability, but not all variability, of course, that we measure in neural measures is noise. Some of the variability is signal, some is noise, and there's very little effort to tease apart what is what so far. Also, neural activity exists on many different levels of aggregation, starting from what happens in a single neuron up to what happens in entire networks. And I expect if I were to look for the signal-to-noise ratio that's relevant for neural computations, I would look at a relatively high level of aggregation. The one paper that Richard Heyer cited earlier today by New and colleagues that just came out with a stability of connectivity patterns, that could be one approach, for instance, to look for a signal-to-noise ratio, because a signal-to-noise ratio essentially means that neural states representing what is essentially for the individual to be treated in the same way should be represented in a consistent, essentially the same way across several repetitions. And neural states representing relevantly different situations should be represented by very different states. And that seems to be pretty much the picture that came out with respect to connectivity patterns in that paper. But of course, it doesn't have to be connectivity patterns. It could also be states of neural activity. But generally, I would look for a high signal-to-noise ratio being reflected in fairly stable, consistent representations of equivalent states and highly distinct representations of non-equivalent states.
Thank you so much.
I did probably slightly related questions, two pieces of historical origin. So if, in Eysenk's 1981 book on intelligence, Hendrickson proposed that the basis of intelligence was reliable signal-to-noise, basically, of neurons. And I think my first paper actually was with Hans testing higher string length because an evoked potential would do the same thing each time to each stimulus. Yes. It was exactly based on the idea of signal-to-noise in single neurons being reflected. And then maybe relatedly, theory out of Australia explaining inspection time, which was exactly about rate of information accumulation on the basis that neurons were reliably extracting that information. So, it's a kind of 40-year history of similar thinking, I think.
Yes, you're right. The basic theoretical idea seems to have popped up every now and then across the history, across the decades, in intelligence research, also in aging research. I think what the innovation we bring to the table is, apart from, I think, conceptualizing it a bit better, I would argue, is that we have a proposal of how to measure the signal-to-noise ratio, at least on the behavioral level, through computational models that extract it as a parameter.
May I add to the comments, which are saying, personally, I'm excited by hearing this proposal because it links our intelligence work with things which were formerly in a bit of a ghetto, radar, looking at messages coming to pilots and things of that sort. So the applied psychology unit of 1960 and 1970 and Broadbent and all those good people. So that's the positive side. I'm wondering whether working memory really is the best testing place or whether it's to one side and that really we have to look at the whole of intelligence. And what would you say to this speculation? One of the problems we have is with such varieties of intelligence that things which I think are signals, a brighter person would understand as being noise. So there's a mutative notion here. It's said of Van Neumann, whenever he came into a situation, he clarified it immediately by simplifying it considerably, all right? Which is entirely in support of your hypothesis. The difficulty is, how do we do that when we're testing people? There's such a range of abilities. My thoughts are probably noise to someone who has a better capacity to understand signals.
Well, my spontaneous thought is a quote attributed to Albert Einstein that we should try to find an explanation as simple as possible, but not simpler. So there are probably limits to how much we can simplify, especially when it comes to the human mind. This is also reflecting my personal experience with modeling a small section of the human mind, which is working memory, and the better my models get, the more complicated they tend to get. I'm not optimistic about being able to simplify things very much. But yes, in general, I hope that the signal-to-noise ratio hypothesis is a step in the right direction, and that it has the potential to find something common across a large variety of cognitive abilities. And as you mentioned, just looking at working memory, as I did for several decades, as an explanation for intelligence is too narrow, because there are other tasks highly correlated with intelligence that I can't really subsume under working memory. And that is what led us eventually to this hypothesis, that signal-to-noise ratio might be the common denominator.
Well, two related questions. Question one, does it change with development? Do you have evidence that there are systematic changes with age?
So far, no, we don't have evidence. It is a prediction that it does improve as children grow older, yeah.
And my second question is, if we can have measures of it with more complex tasks, such as reasoning tasks, for example.
We probably could measure the signal-to-noise ratio with more complex tasks if we developed measurement models for those tasks and then tested these measurement models in many experiments. It is probably not the direction in which I would prefer to go, because the more complex the task is, the more complex my measurement model will be. And something that I learned from hard experience is that if your measurement model reaches a certain level of complexity, it becomes unwieldy and your parameter estimates go all over the place. Right? So these models, they tend to have 2, 3, 4 parameters at best. Once you go beyond that, with current techniques and the limited amount of data, it becomes impossible to measure the parameters with sufficient precision on the level of an individual. And then the models are practically useless for individual differences research. So my tendency is to go in the direction of simplifying the tasks as much as possible.
Yeah, thank you. More questions? Yeah, please.
So I'm a big fan of the drift diffusion model, but there are some people, though, who say that applying the drift diffusion model is just describing the probability distribution of the data, or almost the same thing. They'll say, well, you have a decision process, it unfolds over time, there's uncertainty. Of course, the drift diffusion model has to fit it. It's like, and they'll say, well, it's like something is normally distributed. That doesn't really tell you much about the mechanisms that produce the thing that has that distribution. Mm-hmm. I think I have a way of answering that kind of objection, but I wonder if you're nodding your head, so maybe you've heard this before. You have a way of answering it. I presume you would say, well, I have these other tasks where a signal-to-noise ratio is applicable, and I extract a parameter from those tasks, and I get similar kinds of results. So that kind of objection is met. But that's my prompt to you.
Yes, I've heard this argument before, and I disagree with it. Because I think there's a difference between a descriptive model, and you mentioned just using a normal distribution, or let's say for response times, perhaps a log normal distribution. These distributions describe the data very well, but they tell you nothing about the mechanisms. Right? There's also a history of using, say, the X-Gaussian distribution to fit to response times. It fits beautifully, but it doesn't tell you anything about the mechanisms, because the model is not motivated by any assumptions about the mechanisms. And that's different in the diffusion model. The diffusion model starts from assumptions about what is going on in the mind, and from that derives the distribution. Right? So when we apply the diffusion model, then we buy into a theoretical commitment that the decision relies on evidence accumulation with a certain degree of noise, with a constant drift rate over time, with these boundaries that are also constant. And there's a lot of theoretical debate in that field between different versions of the model that make different assumptions. And that is an important difference from a descriptive model, and that also translates into the fact that the parameters of the model, of the diffusion model, they have a theoretical meaning, right? Whereas the parameters of the ex-Gaussian model, they have no meaning, right? They are really just, the mean, the standard deviation. They have no psychological meaning. That's the difference.
Yeah, that's a very nice final word.
Okay.
Thank you again, Klaus, for coming.